Hello, and welcome back to the School of Self-Worth. One of my goals this year has been to work less, to allow myself to rest more, and then to receive more. It's a continual work in progress. So I am beyond honored to have a conversation with one of the leaders of the rest revolution, Tracee Stanley, author of the best-selling book, Radiant Rest. She has a new book, The Luminous Self, which is devoted to sacred yogic practices and rituals to remember who you are. In this conversation, Tracee shares so many powerful insights on what it takes to live in alignment as your authentic self. I loved her book, and I was really wowed by the depth of the resources that she teaches in there. We get deep in this conversation, and it truly was such an honor to share space with this wise and powerful teacher. Her book is available for pre-order now, and we've got a special code for listeners where you can save 30%. Make sure to check out show notes to buy a copy of The Luminous Self. Okay, let's get into this beautiful conversation. Well, Tracee, it is such a delight to have you here. Welcome to the School of Self-Worth.
Thank you so much, Nicole. I'm so happy to be here.
Well, Tracee, I've heard about you from so many really amazing women that I know who consider you a mentor and as someone who's in the yoga world for a long time, like connections through that space. So I'm really excited to talk to you about this whole journey and to really talk specifically today about your new book, The Luminous Self. So congratulations first.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
That it is in itself a really big journey to put a being like that out into the world. So I know there must be a lot happening with that. What I'd actually love to start with is a quote from the book, and then for us to kind of get into the conversation about what it is, because, you know, this podcast is about the self-worth journey. And while you don't use that language specifically, the book feels very much like that kind of internal journey. So here's a quote from the book. "The need to remember who we are may seem odd, but the true self is waiting to be recognized. Peeling back the layers that cover our inherent beauty and power might be the most important journey of our lives. If we are brave enough to follow the call inward, we can find a sense of freedom from the obstacles in life that keep us bound in suffering and conflict." So it resonated with me because so much of what I do and what I teach is also about that uncovering. Because I think and you speak about this in the book, about that reaching, like we often have this experience of reaching for self outside of ourselves, and that really it's that journey inward. And so I'm curious for you, when you were writing this book, what you really were hoping to do, like what you really wanted to share and teach people with it.
That's a great question. Thank you for that. I really wanted people to understand and have practices that could lead them to a place of more than just an intellectual understanding, but an embodied understanding, that all of the gold and all of the treasure and all of the light and all of the expansiveness and spaciousness that we're seeking and the peace and ease is inside. Mm-hmm. And that is worth everything. That to me is where our self-worth and our worthiness lies. And I feel like the overculture has done a really great job of distracting us so that we feel like it's all external. Mm-hmm. And when we're distracted and awareness is external, it feels like there's no time and there's no space to be still and to be present, to be able to maybe move inward a little bit and find out what's there.
Mm. I feel like I have so many questions, even just about that piece alone. And I will get back to that. One of the questions I have for you is because your first book was really around yoga nidra and rest. And it's really how so many people I know in the world speak of you from that place, like how much you taught them about the power of rest. And I'm curious for you, going from that, you do mention yoga nidra in the book, and you don't actually have a yoga nidra practice almost until the end of the book around ancestors. And so I'm curious for you what you wanted to delineate for people from that practice to this one with this book.
Well, what I felt and what I have noticed from my own practice and also from teaching so many people the practice of yoga nidra is that once you start to become still enough and rested enough, there are some things that start to bubble to the surface.
Mhm.
A lot of what bubbles to the surface can be this idea of the kind of mass that you were holding and the positions you were holding, the jobs, the relationships, all the things that you were holding that are actually not in alignment with who you really are. And those things come up. And then sometimes there's a place of integration that needs to happen, a practice that needs to be given to help to dissolve the discomfort that can arise from being rested. And maybe some people can relate to this idea of when they finally come to their rest practice, they actually realize how exhausted they are,
Mhm.
right? This is very similar. You start to realize, oh, these things are not in alignment. How do I actually work to transition and transform them so that they can lead me deeper into who I am as opposed to further away from who I am? So
Mhm.
for me, these practices, and it's a great question that you asked because this book was actually the first book that I went out with. And then I was asked to write the book on Yoga Nidra. And so, what I realized when I came back to this work was that Yoga Nidra needed to come first, not only for me as an author, but for anybody who is interested in the things that I'm writing. The depth of Yoga Nidra needed to come first to soften us up a little bit, to tenderize our hearts a little bit more, to have us have things rise to the surface that we really were now ready to look at. And we're able to hold the space to look at because we were practicing being still and really partnering with the unknown in the practice of Yoga Nidra. We don't know what's going to come to the surface.
And did you find then, like, you feel like the last work that people were really remind me again of when the last book came out?
That book came out in March of 2022.
Because I was going to say it was right around that space of the pandemic. And were you noticing at that particular period, because it was only a year and a half, less than a year and a half ago, if
Mm-hmm.
people were overamped, like it was so intense, the experience of the pandemic and what you found at that time for people?
Yeah, what I found at that time was that people were in that space of, oh, I have a little bit more time to rest, and I'm going to take advantage of this time to rest. And then when I rest, I realize, A, how exhausted I am, how much grief I have, not only for what is happening in the world, but for the life that I had prior to the pandemic, that I'm not sure what's going to become of that life when the pandemic, if and when it's over. And at the same time, the uncertainty and the fear of being in this void space, of being in this kind of liminal in between space of not knowing, right? So those were all the things that I was noticing. And what I know is that Yoga Nidra is a salve for those things. It's a salve for grief. It's a way to be able to hold grief and to hold uncertainty and to partner with the unknown. So I feel like Yoga Nidra was a very profound practice. And I think the book, it came out at the exact right time to help to address some of these issues that we were all feeling.
Beautiful. And that book is Radiant Rest. And so that one was so powerful. And then really what you felt like is over time now that we're essentially back to our lives. I wouldn't say it's the same as pre-pandemic, but we're back to a very full, I would say, full speed kind of life these days. That what are you hoping that this book is going to address for people then?
I really think it will address the transitions that have come forward, the noticing of the things that are not in alignment, that we're not in alignment, that we don't know what to do with anymore, right? I think a lot of people have talked about relationships kind of falling away during the pandemic and not coming back when everything feels like it's coming back to the whatever the new normal is. Um, so many different relationships, so many different jobs. Um, and I think that people, because we had that period, and I would say that it was like a global practice that we were all doing of stillness for a while and of being in that stillness, we started to realize that maybe we weren't the people that we wanted to be. Maybe we weren't the people that we hoped to be or that we really felt that we were inside. And I think that this book is a way to get back to who you really are.
Well, that is beautiful and powerful and a big journey, is what I would say. My experience, that's my own personal experience. And I'm curious if you could share a little bit more about what that has looked like for you. You have stories in the book itself, but if you could give us a little bit of your background and then what has that uncovering of yourself look like?
Yeah. So, what I would say is my background is I grew up in a very strict household, wasn't allowed to have friends over, wasn't really allowed to go anywhere and do anything as a child. And then finally had some freedom when I was in my later teenage years and kind of traveled the world. And what I would say is that because my parents were very strict, what I didn't know is that it created um, this atmosphere of isolation and created me to be an introvert, right? So I loved books and I loved science and I loved reading and all of these different things. And then when I was in school as a young girl, I was also bullied. And that really created even more of an isolation and introversion. But when I think back to who I really am and what happened before those times, or the times that I felt joy and the times that I felt lots of fun, it always was connected to something greater than me. Right. And what I realized is that that introversion was something that was learned. That wasn't something that was innate, right? And so being able to reclaim curiosity, to reclaim being able to be in relationship with people and feel open, has all been part of the journey. But I wasn't able to access that part of myself until I started yoga practice and until I started specific practices. And those are the practices that I have in the book. I thought about this a lot, and I thought about it really the book as a time capsule. That if I were to be able to bury a time capsule for people to find practices towards liberation, that these would be the practices that I would want them to find. And there are a lot of practices in the book, and there's a reason why there are so many practices, because I feel like each one of those practices is a portal towards awakening. Each one of those practices, when I did them myself, were a portal to understanding a part of myself. That once I got into that deeper understanding, it led to just another piece and another piece and another piece. But I think in order for us to really be in this kind of path of awakening, we really need to be curious.
Mm. So many things come up for me when you say that, but I actually would love to go back to the personality piece first because it's something you address in the book. And I found it to be really interesting, like to have the way you include it in there, because I think a lot of us think that we are our personality. Like I'm an outgoing or I'm in charge, like for women who are strong, like I'm bossy or I'm like whatever it is. And if you could speak more about how you started to unpack that for yourself, learning that you were not exactly what your personality was.
Yeah, I think the first time that I really touched that in a really deep, profound way, my previous career, I was a Hollywood film producer.
Mm.
And I would always have these moments where I would almost hear in my mind, you don't have enough time. There's not enough space. There's not enough time. There's not enough time. But then logically, I would look at the calendar and I would say, oh, no, I know exactly how much time this one thing is going to take, or these 10 things are going to take. And I do have enough time. So, what is this narrative that keeps running that I don't have enough time? Because it makes me feel as though I'm always on edge and I can never relax into what it is that I'm doing. I can never really enjoy what it is that I'm doing because I'm always afraid that I'm not going to have enough time. And so I started to think about this, and I thought about one of the yoga practices that I had learned, which was a yoga practice around, uh, it's called vichara, and it's this practice of deliberation, deliberating until you can find the cause or the root of something. And I started to do this practice, which is called the timeline practice, which is in the book, where I basically just sat myself down, closed my eyes, and thought to myself, when was the last time that you felt that you didn't have enough time and space? And when was the time before that? And the time before that? And I kept going all the way down the timeline until I could remember the very first time. And when I got to that very first time, it was a time when I was about 6 or 7. And there was a little girl in my church who was kind of the belle of the ball, really beautiful, very outgoing, the kind of little girl that every other little girl was looking at and going, wow, I wish I could be like her. And unfortunately, there was a fire in her home and she wasn't able to escape the fire and she died. And I overheard my mom talking to other people from the church. And I overheard her say, she just ran out of time. She didn't have enough time. And I realized that I had taken that statement as a little girl and basically carried it with me throughout my life as a narrative that, oh, there's not enough time. I could run out of time. And then eventually I forgot the source and then just held it as a belief. And that became part of my personality. The part of my personality that informed was the part of me that could multitask, the part of me that could juggle a million things, the part of me that was always rushing, the part of me that wasn't resting prior to learning the practice of Yoga Nidra. And when I finally became acquainted with Yoga Nidra, that began to soften, I think, even the awareness, the spaciousness that even allowed that me to take the pause in in those moments to even trace back to that original belief. And so that for me then became, okay, now I know what this seed is. What is the antidote to the seed? What is the antidote to this narrative that I don't have enough time, I don't have enough space? And I just flipped it very clearly. I said, okay, every time I start to feel, because I noticed also that there was a vibration around this narrative, that I would start to feel it in my nervous system, that every time I would start to feel this, or every time I would start to think this, I would force myself to stop. And I would just repeat to myself 3 times with 3 deep breaths, I have enough time. I have enough space. And that was literally my affirmation for probably about 6 months until I felt it unwind. I felt it unwind itself.
I really love what you're sharing about how there was just something so old. And this is what so many of us don't know. Something old informed a behavior that became for you this experience of rushing all the time. And then would you say then since then you unwound it, right? It took you 6 months to basically unwind it, that it's become something where you're like, oh, I can choose. That's actually what I heard is you found out that you could actually choose to rush or to not rush.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think that part 2 of that was I could choose to rush, I could choose to not rush. And then the next piece of that was this practice of Yoga Nidra transforms our relationship with time and space. Mm. And what I noticed is that I can do and be in a space of a minute without rushing and accomplish the same thing that someone else who's rushing and needs 15 minutes to get it done can do, because there's just a different cadence. It's just a different vibration that starts to unfold when you become acquainted with your rest itself. Mm. Right. And that rest itself is more clear. That rest itself doesn't need to go through from A to Z to figure out a problem. Right. The rest itself can go from A to the answer without going through all the machinations of the mind to get there that would normally happen because there's space in the mind. That's my experience.
Well, when you share it that way, it feels like all the things that so many people want of space, time, and really speaking in. And when you speak that way, I also hear that you move more intuitively through things. And would you say that that's an access point that yoga nidra gives you to really intuitively lead versus, logically or using cognitive, decision making power to figure something out?
Yeah, I think that in intuition and knowing definitely lead the way. But I think the foundation that supports it is past experience, logic, intellect, but it's definitely not led from a place of um, feeling the urgency that is can be in ourselves really and in our DNA. It's not led from that place. So in a lot of ways, it is letting go of the hold or the grip that the overculture has on us that tells us we have to do, we have to hurry, we're going to miss out. And it allows us to actually be in the cadence more of nature, right? Which is not rushing. Nature is intuitive, and you don't go out and plant a seed and the next day the seed is like fully bloomed into a flower.
Right. Well, I'm curious then, because you had your own experience of rushing from when you were a kid. And how do you do with it now? Because it's not, when you were sharing that, I was like, oh, it's so profound because it's such a personal thing that you move through. And we live in a culture that does that all the time. I mean, you refer to it in your book too, where everything is like faster, more. And you talk about memory too, which I'd like to get into. But I'm first curious about how to handle the fact that we live literally immersed in a world that's constantly like on the clock, do this, next this, we're all getting calendars and alerts and beeps and things. And so how do you navigate that?
Yeah, I don't really allow myself to be in that space, to be
Mm.
honest. I think that there are sacred boundaries that we need to create
Mhm.
around what is our capacity, right? So my capacity right now in this launch period is, 2 podcast interviews a day spaced out over X amount of time, right?
Mhm.
So that I know that I can still do my practices in the morning. I know that I can meet with clients and not feel rushed, right? I know that when we try to hop on and the Zencaster isn't working, that it's not like a freak out crisis moment. It's like, oh, let's just shift to another platform and keep it going. So I think that we have to create boundaries. I started to create those boundaries when I was still in my Hollywood job. And the way that I did that at first was I don't answer the phone after 7 o'clock. And that was like, you know, mind blowing to people because people were sleeping and still do sleep with their phones under the pillow. And you're expected to be, available 24/7 for things that are not urgent, right? Because everybody else is in the urgency, they're in the crisis. It's like, well, is this really urgent? Is this really a crisis? So that was like the first boundary that I started to set. And then I started to move that into weekends. Like,
Mm.
I don't work on weekends. I'm going to read scripts on the weekend in the morning, and then I'm going to be done. I know it takes me an hour and 10 minutes to read a script. I'm going to be done and with my family and with the things that are life affirming for me. And then that was the other thing is like, I'm only saying yes to what's life affirming.
Mm.
If it feels extractive or it feels exhausting, then it's a no. And I'm very aware that that's a privilege to be able to do. But I think that we can all find little sacred boundaries that we can create that will help us to reclaim time and space for ourselves in a way that feels nourishing.
Sometimes I find too, so I also get caught up in this and the, social media and all these things, having a business. And what I found, and I like your language, sacred boundaries, but I actually made a commitment to read a lot of books. And reading books actually has pulled me off my phone, which I really like. And that's one of the reasons people are like, do you want to read so much? Isn't that feel like pressure? I'm like, no, reading books does not feel like pressure. Like reading a book over lunch feels like, oh, I got like my 20 pages of I like to read novels mostly, like just this cool, wonderful world that's really creative. I feel much more relaxed because I'm not scrolling. And then, I go on a walk with my dog and I might check my phone at a later time, but it gives me a lot of space. But it's sort of an interesting thing because I chose something that I really love. to
Mhm.
replace something that was like really intense and not working for me. So, anyways, that came up when you were speaking because I was like, oh, yeah, it has become a sacred boundary to read instead of be on my phone, instead of the
Mhm.
things that are like asking for my attention all the time.
Beautiful. I love that. I love that. And I would just suggest for anybody who's listening is to just maybe even pause this for a second and think about some of the boundaries that you can create within your family, within your business, with friends, just to reclaim a little bit more space.
Well, and it leads me to the part of your book that I really tuned into because I feel like it's where people find a lot of challenge, and it's the area about resistance and obstacles, and how you shared about how to look at them rather than avoid them to
Hmm.
help yourself with it. And I'll share the six. Is it six? It's five: procrastination,
Hmm.
doubt, fear, anger, and then we've been talking about urgency. And I'm curious because do you still practice it daily? Oh, my dog cares about this one. Do you practice daily? How do you look at it when you feel that resistance or obstacles come up? Any of those five, what is it that you start to do to address it? Because I know the tendency would probably be to like shove it down or to avoid it because it's uncomfortable. We don't want to deal with it. And how do you like to approach it?
Yeah, I mean, I like to think about these obstacles and any kind of discomfort at all as a portal to more expansiveness. So anytime that I feel any kind of discomfort or resistance, I look at where is the resistance coming from and what is the antidote to the resistance. And I have a daily mind mapping practice where I'm actually able to look at the obstacles. So my mind map has an obstacle bubble. And in the other part of the mind map, it has an auspicious action bubble. And that's where I create the actions that are the antidotes for the obstacles. So if I'm feeling, let's say, procrastination, that's one that I definitely can attune to because
Mm-hmm.
I experience that. Okay, it's procrastination. So, what is the seed of this procrastination? Usually for me, it's some sort of fear of moving forward,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so then I start to address, okay, instead of facing the fear head on, like a bull in a china shop, let me chip away at it little by little, right? Because I'm doing this daily mapping practice. What is one thing that I can do today that is moving towards that goal or that thing that I'm procrastinating towards? And it only has to be a little micro movement because tomorrow I'm probably still going to have that procrastination in that obstacle bubble, but I can do another micro movement. And before I know it, by the end of the week or by the end of maybe 2 weeks, I've now moved through and completed whatever that thing is. I've moved through the fear. And so that's how I really like to work with obstacles. I feel like the mind mapping every day, it's something that takes less than 5 minutes to do, is really powerful. And I feel like it really does shift the neural pathways in the brain because it gives you a different way of looking at some of the things that we want to avoid. And avoidance is a form of procrastination.
Absolutely. Well, that's what I liked when you listed it out and that there were different practices in there. And as you were speaking, it led me to how many practices there are in the book. Because, like you said, you're like, this is the book that if people would bury it and dig it up, this would have everything in there. And where would you even begin to start for someone who is new to this and saying, okay, Tracee, yes, I'm in. I want to uncover all these pieces of me. And yet, how do I begin? How do I start to tackle anything that relates to me having this discomfort? I've never really practiced sitting with my discomfort on this level. Like, how would you help them start to tackle it and look at it?
Mm. Well, the first thing I would say is having a support system is really important, especially if this is the first time that you're looking at some of these things. So if you have a mentor or you have an elder or you have a therapist, somebody that you can, kind of share what the things are that you're learning, even if you have a buddy who wants to go through the book along with you so that you have someone to talk to is really a great idea if this is your first time going through practices and inquiries like this. But I wrote the book in a way where I feel that the practices are cumulative. And so I think about this idea of the revealing, right? Like we're peeling back the layers, is that once we peel back the layers from the first couple of chapters and we have a little bit of an understanding of that, then we're ready for the next practices. And I make suggestions around how long you should do these practices. And the more you do them with devotion and consistency, the more powerful they are. So I would really suggest having a support system, a friend, a therapist, a mentor, and then going through the book slowly, right? Because we do a lot of these things with the same urgency that the dominant culture wants us to have, because when we have that urgency, we miss things. So if we think about taking this sweet medicine, just little by little, read and then go live life and see how these things percolate within you.
When you say that, I think about all the things I like to rush and then the things that I have to always practice slowing down. For me, like I've been doing some yoga nidra at home, and there's a part of me that's often like, I just don't really want to lay down for 20 minutes. Like that just seems silly and ridiculous. And then I'm like, no, Nicole, like you need it. Like just go do it. And then I always pop up and I have so much energy. Like I always come out of it feeling so good. I'm like, well, this is why you should keep doing this, because you feel so much better at the end of it, whether it's the end of the workday or just wanting to do it in the middle of the day. But I think about that, like it's like that resistance. It's like, I don't want to do it. And yet let me just do the one thing that's going to help myself through it. So I love that for you. Because again, so it sounds like then really in the book, it's like starting from the beginning, picking one. And then I think you do say in the book, you're like, if this isn't working for you, you can move on. Like you don't have to be attached to the order
That's right.
in which things are going on in there.
Yeah. And there will be some practices that will totally speak to you. And then, okay, this is my practice. I'm going to do this one for 30 to 60 days. And they're not long practices. And I think, you hit on something really important when there's the resistance to practice, right? Because sometimes we do have that feeling like, oh, this is silly, it's not worth it. And then if we start to dig a little bit deeper, it's like, I'm not worth it, right? And then we have to really ask ourselves these questions of what messages did we get around rest? What messages did we get around the worthiness of being devoted to a practice that can heal us or make us a better person? And I think that that is something that we all need to really embrace, is, as you talk about it, obviously in your podcast, is this idea of we are all born worthy. There's nothing that happened to us in life to make us unworthy. And that's what I love about some of the yoga philosophy, is the yoga philosophy tells us that there's this place inside of us that is a place in the heart, in the lotus of the heart, that is beyond all sorrow. It's beyond all conditioning. And it's pristine, effulgent, worthy, beautiful, and powerful and knowing. And that's the place that these practices bring us back to, is to understanding that that is really who we are.
That's so profound. I feel like because yoga was my journey too, as well. Like that's where I started to understand that I could, not be on call for my job at the paper, to separate myself, to have like mental space, and then also to understand that I was not my thoughts. Like that was a whole very long journey practice to really see that. And then, coming back into it. And I'm curious for you too, if this ever happens. And sometimes I notice it's like, how do we separate ourselves from that and yet still live life? And I think that's always like that integrated part of it is always what is the biggest challenge. You can step into it and say, okay, I am worthy of these practices. I am worthy of all of this, and yet still be able to handle challenges or unpredictable things. And you talk about many of your own experiences in life with relationships and other pieces. And at this point in your life, how would you say when the unexpected occurs, or like a pandemic or something really challenging, what is your go-to to really cope with it?
That's a great question. So it depends on what's happening. But I think that in any crisis, there is this level of uncertainty. And I really feel that Yoga Nidra because you are moving into this space of the hypnagogic, which is the space between being awake and being asleep. You're in the liminal space and you're kind of hovering in that space. This is a practice that actually it really holds you in the liminal and allows you to dissolve the fears that might be around that, or at least to become familiar with that space. So I think for me, it's all about what is the reflection. So in the pandemic, it was kind of like, oh, we're in this place of uncertainty. Let me make a list of the things that I'm afraid of losing,
Mm.
right? And then what can I do about those things? There's some things I can't do anything about losing them. But I know that if I'm afraid of losing my mom or my stepdad because they're older and they have, comorbidities, then I'm going to spend as much time on FaceTime as I can with them, talking with them, hearing stories from them. And I'm also going to keep myself away from them, right? To keep them safe. I'm going to do whatever it is that I need to keep them to do to keep them safe, which is, you know, those are two opposites. It's like
Mm-hmm.
stay away and be close. And how can I bring those two things together and integrate them in a way that makes sense? So I think being able to really bring these practices in, recognize patterns, I think is really important. There's one question that I refer to in the book, which is what are the lessons that we're tired of learning? And I think that's a really great question to always ask yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And then to ask yourself, why do you keep learning them?
Yeah, that's a good one. That's like I hit you in the gut. You're like, ooh, same lesson over and over again. It's time to be curious there.
Yeah, exactly. I think one of the things that I also noticed in my time in Hollywood when I left my job and started my own company and the reason I did that was because I wanted things to be more spacious, to be more slow, to be more intentional. I wanted to have more time to read and meet the directors and writers that I wanted to work with and do the kinds of projects that I wanted to do. And what I noticed was all of a sudden the pace of what I was used to was different. And I started to notice that I was addicted to the crisis. I was addicted to the emergency that would come up that needed to get fixed. And then I had to do another inquiry into what's the seed of this. And then I realized, oh, I'm validating myself by
Yeah.
being the one who does the fixing. I'm actually looking for the crisis. And then do I have to like look even deeper? Am I doing anything subconsciously that's causing the crisis? So when you think about this idea of procrastination, it's like if you procrastinate and wait till the last minute, things start to get really tense and you get to be the one to fix it or to save it.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that that happens a lot in our society and we don't even realize it. So to just circle back to your question about how do you deal with crisis, I think that we should all kind of look at what is happening in our bodies when this crisis is happening. What's happening in the mind? Can I create a new neural pathway right now about how I think about crisis? Can I come
Yeah.
up with an antidote that takes me in a different direction that I would normally go?
So beautiful. Well, Tracee, there's been so much wisdom in what you're sharing, and for sure in the book. So I know I could talk to you for so long, and it is time for us to do our rapid fire questions.
Okay.
So, yeah. Well, the first one is if you're a TV watcher, what did you last watch on TV?
I'm currently watching Dark Winds.
Dark Winds. I haven't
Yeah.
seen that. What is it about?
Dark Winds takes place on a pueblo in Navajo Nation.
Mm.
And it's basically this uh, indigenous, I think he's a lieutenant. His son was murdered, And he's basically looking for all the clues to find out what happened to his son. But there's lots of like witchcraft and mystical things happening at the same time as an underpinning. It's a very cool show.
Well, I will put it on my list. Okay. What is on your nightstand?
Oh, that's a good question. On my nightstand are mugwort oil, African dream oil, a dream salve, my dream journal, my night mask, my eye mask, and I know I'm forgetting something. Oh yeah, my tourmaline crystal.
Cool. I love the dream part in the book. I was like, I want to do that, have a dream journal. She shares all about that inside. Okay. When was the last time you tried something new and what was it?
The last time I tried something new, I think the last time I tried something new is recently because I'm doing a course. Um, it's a 13-week course on advanced ecotherapy.
Hmm,
And
very cool.
we're in week 3, so that's new.
That is definitely new. Amazing. Okay, last one. What are the top 3 most used emojis on your phone?
The heart fire,
Mhm,
the candle, the one with the little, looks like a little arty candle,
mhm.
um, and the lotus.
Beautiful. Well, Tracee, really, truly, it's such an honor to have you on the podcast. I love having you here. And so, everybody, please make sure you go out and buy the Luminous Self Sacred Yogic Practices and Rituals to remember who you are. We have a little discount for you if you pre-order. And please let us know, what is your actual publishing date?
October 10th.
October 10th. So pre-order by then. We'll have the link in our show notes. And if you use the discount code listed in there, you can get 30% off. So Tracee, I'm so grateful to you for this conversation. It's so beautiful. I'm so glad you're here with us.
Thank you so much, Nicole. It's been an honor.